It was 1978, and my family had just moved from Canada to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. My father was a petroleum engineer, and the oil company he worked for had us placed in a hotel while we waited for company housing to be ready. Many other expat families shared the hotel with us. I was in the second grade at the time, and we had to stay in this hotel for about 1, maybe 2 weeks. Since there were many other expat families staying in the hotel, it was easy to find other children to play with, and because it was summertime, there was no shortage of time to actually play, since school hadn't started yet. I was an active boy, and a pretty cute kid, so I figure both of these factors maybe helped play into what happened later. Me and the other kids would invent games to pass the time, and use the hotel as our play area. When we weren't creating games, we fell back on old classics, and one of our favorites was hide and seek. We would use the elevators to hide on all different floors, and on one particular day, I decided to take the elevator to the highest floor in the hotel. As I think back, I'm pretty sure that it topped out at the 30th floor. As I exited the elevators and rounded the corner from the elevators into a side hallway, I ran into a couple, an older man and woman. I stopped short in an attempt to keep myself from physically running into them, but that's when the man grabbed me by my arm. I instinctively pulled away. I quickly backed away from them until there was maybe 10 feet between us. I stood on the balls of my feet, on the verge of bolting. I can remember clearly how short-lived this sort of standoff occurred. The couple standing in front of me, positioned closest to the stairwell, smiling and staring at me, while I stood closest to the bank of elevators I had just come from. The man and woman's reaction to seeing me in the hallway seemed that they were acting in the spur of the moment, which made their demeanor and intentions even more creepy, even in my 7-year-old brain. That's when the man took a chocolate bar out of his pocket. Being a kid, I definitely took a peek at that candy bar, and although I can't remember what brand it was, I do remember that it had nuts in it, because I hated chocolate bars with nuts in them. In this brief face-off, as we stared at each other, the man and woman kept the smiles on their face, but after a few moments, the veneer almost wiped away, and it was easy to tell that these were very fake smiles. But it was as if they served the purpose of trying to coax me towards them, as if they were my friends. The man was waving the chocolate bar at me as if he was trying to offer me a gift, but his demeanor and his fake friendly face were definitely saying something more evil. I continued to stand on the balls of my feet, ready to turn and sprint off at any moment. The man and woman were leaning slightly forward, their body postures screaming that they were on the verge of lunging at me. The reason that I hadn't run to that point was because I really had nowhere to run to. If I ran to the elevators, they would surely get me before the elevator made its way back to my floor. And if I tried to run past them to get to the stairwell, they would have easily been able to nab me. So, again, there was nowhere for me to go. I think the only reason they didn't attempt to grab me immediately was because they wanted to take me without a fuss. After all, we were standing in a hallway full of other rooms, and if I screamed or started banging on the walls, it could easily attract the attention of other guests. When it was clear that I wasn't going to take the candy, I could see the man and woman's body postures change even more. It wasn't a series of quick movements. For those of you that have pets, it was almost as if they were puppies, and they were practicing their creep and pounce. I can still remember that sinking feeling in my gut, because I had almost given up. I felt as if they were going to grab me. But right at that moment, like I had a guardian angel looking over me, the elevator dinged and someone got off on that floor. I don't remember who my savior was or what they looked like, but when the elevator rang, I turned and ran for it. This couple I'm sure feeling as if they were nearly caught red-handed. They turned and briskly walked in the opposite direction down the hallway. I assume either towards the stairwell or whatever room they were in. I burst past the person exiting onto that floor and through the elevator's open door. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if that person hadn't gotten off on the floor that I was on. Was that couple trying to abduct me because they wanted a child of their own? Or were their intentions even more nefarious than that? My wife and I just recently moved to a new city with my boss and his family so that I could continue working for them. They found a nice building to buy. There's a storefront on the main floor, as well as 2 apartments, one in the basement and one on the top floor, so we can all live and work in the same building. My boss and his family took the basement apartment and arranged for my wife and I to move into the upper apartment, simply saying to us, "It needs some work," which had to be the understatement of the year. The previous upstairs tenant had to be evicted from the property. He had destroyed literally everything within the apartment, including every floor, appliance, wall, door, and even window. The place needed new everything, in addition to a whole lot of love. We were also told that the old tenant didn't take the eviction particularly well, and in fact, still believed that he lived in the apartment. In addition, the guy spent most of the last 12 years in and out of jail for various crimes committed. My wife, the wiser of the 2 of us if push ever came to shove, insisted on buying a camera for the doorbell. On the 3rd day of us renovating the apartment, we hear the doorbell ring. I get up to answer it and instinctively unlock the door, assuming that it was my boss, when my wife starts shouting for me to shut it. While this caught me off guard, I did what my wife urged me to do. Within nanoseconds of unlatching the door and beginning to turn the handle, I relock the door and step away from it. That's when I hear a voice from the other side ask, "Hello?" So I respond in kind, "Hello?" That's when I was met with an angry, "Who's in my f***ing house?" Now, I'll spare you the details and just say that it was the old tenant who, from the sounds of it, was very disgruntled. After standing at the door, huffing and puffing for minutes on end, he finally left when I told him that he needed to leave before the cops got here, in what was my best tough guy voice. As you might have been able to tell, my wife checked the doorbell notification just as I was opening the door. I'm glad she did, because her warning was the only thing that kept me from opening the door to a large, angry man with a full bottle of Jim Beam in his hand, one who thought we were strangers in his home. I learned a lesson that afternoon. Always check the app before opening the door. But the story doesn't end there. Later that night, my wife and I were in bed watching TV. It had to be after midnight by this point. That's when we heard a thumping coming from the living room. It started low, just barely audible. Sounded far off at first, like it may have been coming from downstairs, but it was persistent and just got louder and louder, while also picking up the pace. I got up and told my wife to pause our show. I grabbed the hammer we were using during our renovations just hours earlier and ran into the living room in only my undies, just in time to hear heavy footsteps retreating down the stairs outside of our unit. I kept the main light off, but poked my head through the curtains to see if I could see anybody leaving our building. Sure enough, I saw a large figure walking away through the park across the street from our new residence. Whoever it was looked to be wearing the same clothes as the former tenant that showed up earlier. So I guess I don't really have to say whoever it was. After I watched the guy walk off, I went to the front door and opened it just slightly, that's when I noticed the gigantic boot prints on the door. The guy was trying to kick the door down. Now, while that kept me awake for the rest of the night, the part that creeps me out just as much is that the walls here are so thin that you can hear everything. I can hear my boss talking on the phone 2 floors below us. The ex-tenant knew we were home because he would have easily heard the television. If he knew we were home, then I have no idea why he was trying to open the front door in the middle of the night, or why he ran away when I came running. Did he expect us to be asleep? And what was going to happen if he got that door down before I came out? Being that we just moved in, we don't really have the luxury of going anywhere else, nor do we plan on leaving our new apartment. I'm hoping with all my heart he doesn't come back. But the more I think about it, it might just be naive on my part to think that this will be the only run-in we'll have with this guy. I work as a nurse, and the last senior care home I worked in housed an elderly African-American man who had served a life sentence in the penitentiary up the road from my house. This man went to prison for murdering his wife, though of course, he claimed he was innocent. I learned very quickly during my first week that a murderer lived on the 2nd floor of our manor. At this point, he was paralyzed from the neck down on his right side, bedbound, had a large coccyx wound that required constant dressing changes, had diabetes among other health issues, and was on isolation for MRSA. Most of the nurses steered clear of his room if they could help it. But I myself am a bit twisted, and discovering his crime only drew me closer to this man. Before he was ever assigned as my resident for a shift, I made up any excuse I could to form some kind of rapport with him. I would gown up in my PPE and bring him his pills if his nurse didn't feel comfortable, or I would give him his meal tray. The first time I entered his room, I was greeted by the horrendous smell of his wound that seemed to linger in the air. I was told he would often refuse care, and quite literally was rotting in his bed. I don't know what I expected, but when I first saw this man, it was clear that I wasn't welcome in his room. If looks could kill, he would have sent me to the afterworld immediately. He was cold, irritable, and rude. I have a bubbly personality and did my best to pay him no mind. I treated him like any other resident and talked to him as if I were talking to an old friend. After a solid week of popping in, it seemed like he grew to like me. Obviously, I am bound by patient confidentiality and cannot tell you his name, but for this discussion, we can refer to him as A. The first thing that I learned was that A loved to talk. He complained to anyone who would listen and preached about the importance of honesty and respect. He was often in a sour mood, but when I stepped into his room, I would make it my goal to get him to laugh. It was how he became comfortable in my presence. A told me that he had been arrested in 1984, and the way he spoke and viewed the world made it evident that he was still stuck in the 80s and didn't understand the way the world was to date. He also wasn't used to being surrounded by women and was shocked with how silly we could be and our senses of humor. His room was always pitch black because he refused to open his blackout curtains. When I asked him about it, he told me it was what he was used to, as his prison cell was dark. Even after his sentence was served, he had stayed in the prison for almost the same amount of time because he had poor health and had nowhere else to go. Care homes are hard to get into to begin with, and many seniors are put on waiting lists that can take months, if not years. Care homes also decide who they will take, and many declined admission to a convicted murderer. Behind bars became the only life A felt comfortable with, as it was his home for the majority of his life. I've watched many serial killer documentaries, and a lot of those killers look like evil people. But when A liked you, he looked like any other normal human being. He liked music and movies, acted loyal to his friends, and hated hot turkey sandwiches. He was always respectful to me, and even offered to phone up a prison buddy because I told him I was interested in nursing at the penitentiary, and he said that his buddy would protect me. That said, he could also be extremely manipulative towards other nurses and knew just how to intimidate others. If he didn't like you, he made that extremely clear. A grew up in a poor community dominated by black men and women in Nova Scotia, Canada, one that no longer exists today. He was raised by his grandmother and aunt because his mother was busy battling her own demons. As a young child, A would be locked out of his house and spent many nights on the street eating garbage to survive. His aunt both physically and sexually assaulted him from the age of 4 until 9. She would invite both men and women over to the house and collect money from them so that they could do as they wished with A. When he was 9 years old, he became strong enough to stand up for himself and told his aunt, "You will never touch me again." And from that day on, she didn't. He spoke lovingly about his grandmother, and it was my understanding that the abuse had occurred during the times when she wasn't home. When he was 12, he was playing outside and saw his neighbor, who was drunk and in his mid-40s, take his young daughter away from their house to the woods. A could hear what he called gross sounds coming from the bush near the tree line. He approached to see this man assaulting his daughter, who was no more than 6 years old. A grabbed the largest stick he could find and came to her rescue. The man was too focused on the assault and didn't hear A come up behind him. A brought that stick down hard on the man's head. He told me that he beat him so badly that the man walked with a limp that never quite healed. The man had been so drunk he didn't even know it was A that hurt him. Another neighbor of his had a fence around the backyard, and A would peek over the fence because these neighbors loved making home movies. He never forgot the time the lady of the house created a horrible movie involving the family dog as her husband filmed it. This was all viewed as normal in his community. To give you an idea, this was A's childhood. A met his wife when he was in his early 20s. She had 3 children fathered by 3 different men, but he cared for them as if they were his own. He played the saxophone and spent most of his time on the road touring with his band. He would also transport drugs across the US border in order to earn some extra cash. When he came home, more often than not, he would discover his wife in bed with another man. This became his norm, and he told me that he would never fight with her because the kids were always around, and he didn't want to argue in their presence because it wasn't right. His wife was a drug addict and spent what little money they had on white powder. A would give her $2,500, and she would snort it away in less than a few hours. I asked why he continued to give her money, and he said, so the kids could have food while he was away. What she did with it when he was gone was out of his control. He stayed in the relationship because he loved the kids. He insisted multiple times that he never put a hand on her because he didn't believe in hitting a woman. He said that he firmly believed hitting women was wrong. I never got to ask A if he killed his wife. I left the manor and was hired at a local hospital and couldn't visit him due to COVID. The nurses at the manor said that A, his wife, and his brother-in-law got into an altercation outside of a bar. Apparently, A was on drugs, beat up the brother-in-law, and stabbed his wife to death. A told me he never did drugs because he had tried marijuana with a friend one time and didn't like how it made his head feel. He also saw the negative impact that drugs had on his mother and his wife. When he was transporting drugs, he dealt with all kinds of f***ed up people, and never wanted his, quote, brain to become mush. He did it for the money. He was against hitting women because he said women were fragile and couldn't fend for themselves. It reminded him of when he was a helpless boy. He said he was blamed for her murder and stated one of her lovers did it because she owed him drug money. A white police officer arrested A and was eager to be rid of the case, so he pinned it on him. Remember, it was the 80s, and the locals hated the community from which A was from. The crime rate was so high that the police couldn't keep up with it. A insisted he wasn't even there when his wife was murdered. He said he did not snap and kill his wife because he didn't want his children to be motherless. Now, murderers have a way of manipulating people and playing the victim. I couldn't find anything about A's case online. If he killed his wife, I doubt that he would confess to me, although I suppose we'll never know now. This was my encounter with a murderer. What do you make of this story?